The darkest corner of Nazi-occupied Poland, 23 women share a secret that could cost them all their lives. Behind the damp walls of their prison cell, where hope has long been extinguished, something impossible is growing, a fragile heartbeat that defies the machinery of death surrounding them. As Allied bombs fall in the distance, these starving prisoners must make an unthinkable choice. Protect this forbidden life and face execution, or surrender their last grip on humanity to survive another day. But when a guard's suspicious gaze lingers too long, and a whispered betrayal threatens their fragile solidarity, time is running out. What these women don't know is that their secret will trigger a chain of events so profound that even their Nazi captors won't see it coming. A revelation that will change everything in the final moments before dawn. The damp walls of the prison cell echoed with moans of pain and whispers of muffled prayers. Every sound carried the weight of despair, hanging in the stale air like invisible chains. In the corner of the overcrowded cell, a young Polish woman with a pale face sat hunched over. Zofia trembled as she pressed her hands against her abdomen. A secret pulsed inside, invisible to the guards, yet impossible to hide from her fellow prisoners. Each click of boots in the corridor sounded like a death sentence. Each shadow passing their cell door made her blood freeze in her veins. A drop of sweat trickled down Zofia's spine despite the biting cold. Her fingernails dug into her palms as she fought to keep her expression neutral, to swallow the nausea that threatened to reveal everything. The air was heavy with fear and forced silence. But there was something else, an unspoken pact forming in the shadows. The women knew they were guarding a life, and that knowledge could cost them their own. An elderly prisoner named Helena noticed the signs first. Her sharp eyes caught how Zofia's hands instinctively slid over her belly with an almost tender caress, how she winced when standing too quickly, how she pushed her meager portion of bread toward others while claiming she wasn't hungry. Helena shuffled closer across the filthy floor, her bones creaking like rusty hinges. She leaned in, her breath sour from hunger, her stern gaze fixed on Zofia's face. "You must contain yourself," she whispered, her voice a harsh rasp against Zofia's ear. "If they discover it, we'll have no way to save you." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Helena's eyes darted to the cell door, then back to Zofia's abdomen. "They'll take you away. You know what happens then." Zofia's throat constricted, blocking any reply. She knew. They all knew. The women who disappeared in the night, the distant screams that sometimes carried from the medical building. Instead of speaking, she gave a slight nod, her fingers unconsciously drifting to her belly before she forced them back to her sides. This secret created constant tension among them all. The cell, barely 15 feet square, housed 23 women. There was no privacy, no place to hide weakness or secrets. Some looked at Zofia with compassion, their eyes softening when they caught her protective gesture. Others watched with resentment. Each hidden resource for her meant less bread for all. Each risk taken for her sake endangered everyone. The cell divided itself between hope and suspicion, between protection and self-preservation. A woman named Irina with hollowed cheeks turned away whenever Zofia approached, as if pregnancy were contagious. "She'll kill us all," Irina had muttered once, loudly enough for others to hear. "One mistake and the guards will make examples of every one of us." At night, when darkness swallowed their emaciated forms, Helena slipped next to Zofia on the cold floor. Her weathered hand found Zofia's beneath the threadbare blanket, squeezing once. A gesture of solidarity that made Zofia's eyes burn with unshed tears. The moonlight filtering through the high barred window cast skeleton-like shadows across their faces. Helena held Zofia's hand like one might hold a bomb about to detonate, with caution, with fear, but refusing to let go. The suspense suffocated the cramped space, wrapping around them tighter than hunger. Every cough might draw attention. Every whispered word could be overhead. From somewhere distant, a newborn baby cried in another wing, a cruel reminder of the fate that might await. The sound cut through the night like a knife, making Zofia curl tighter around her secret. "How long?" Helena's whisper barely disturbed the air. 5 months, Zofia breathed back, the admission costing her dearly. "Maybe 6. Helena closed her eyes, calculations and possibilities flickering behind her eyelids. "We have to make it to Spring," she finally said. "The Allies are pushing east. We hear the guards talking." "I won't make it to Spring," Zofia replied, her voice breaking on the last word. A sudden noise in the corridor silenced them, the rhythmic thud of boots against concrete growing louder. The night count. The women straightened instinctively, trained by months of captivity to present themselves properly, even half asleep. Zofia pulled the thin blanket higher, her heart hammering so loudly she feared the guard would hear it. The cell door scraped open. A beam of harsh light swept across their faces, making them squint and turn away. The guard moved methodically, counting with a bored efficiency that somehow made it all the more terrifying. These weren't people to him, just numbers to be tallied, inventory to be checked. Zofia kept her eyes downcast, her breath shallow, willing herself to become invisible. The beam of light paused briefly on Helena's face, then moved to Zofia. She felt the heat of it on her skin, but didn't raise her eyes. One movement out of place could give her away. Helena's hand tightened around hers beneath the blanket, both women frozen in place as the seconds stretched unbearably. The light lingered. Zofia's pulse roared in her ears. She could feel his gaze boring into her, and fought the urge to place her hand protectively over her belly. Had someone informed on her? Had her careful concealment failed? The guard shifted his weight, the floorboard creaking beneath him. The beam of light remained fixed on Zofia for what felt like eternity. Finally, in a voice flat with indifference, he barked, "Look up." Zofia raised her face slowly, careful to keep her expression blank despite the terror coursing through her veins. Her eyes met his, cold, assessing, unreadable. He studied her face for long seconds, his expression giving nothing away. Then, without warning, his gaze dropped to her midsection, covered by the thin blanket. The entire cell held its breath. No one moved. No one spoke. The only sound was the distant cry of that other baby, haunting them with what might come. The guard's eyes narrowed slightly, focusing on something no one else dared acknowledge. He knew. Zofia was certain he knew. Her secret was written in the slight fullness of her cheeks that hadn't yet succumbed to starvation, in the way she held herself, in some indefinable change that his trained eye had caught. In this moment, her fate, and possibly the fate of all 23 women, hung by a thread. The guard's lips parted as if to speak. Every woman in the cell felt the words coming, the accusation that would shatter their fragile ecosystem of survival. But then, inexplicably, he closed his mouth, gave a final sweep of his light across the huddled forms, and stepped back toward the door. The relief was palpable as the door clanged shut, the key turning in the lock with a sound like fate itself. But as the footsteps receded down the corridor, Zofia caught Helena's expression, not relief, but deepening dread. Because the guard's final glance back had fixed on Zofia with something like certainty, as if he had perceived something that no one else had dared to admit. He would be back, and next time, there would be no reprieve. The following morning broke with harsh clarity, sunlight filtering through the single barred window in jagged rectangles across the filthy floor. The women awoke as they always did, with that brief, terrible moment when reality returned before memory could shield them from it. For Zofia, that moment stretched longer each day, her hand automatically finding her belly before her conscious mind could stop the gesture. A sudden noise shattered the morning routine, the unmistakable rhythm of marching boots echoing down the corridor. Not the usual morning patrol. Too deliberate. Too early. The women exchanged glances, a current of fear electrifying the stale air. Something was wrong. The cell door swung open with a metallic screech that set teeth on edge. Framed in the doorway stood the same guard who had stared at Zofia the night before. His face was expressionless, his uniform immaculate, a stark contrast to their filthy rags and hollowed faces. He stepped inside, boots leaving muddy imprints on the floor where they slept. The women shrank back instinctively, creating a small space of dangerous attention around him. His cold eyes scanned the room methodically, lingering on each face as if memorizing it. The prisoners held their breath collectively. When his gaze finally settled on Zofia, Time seemed to stop. Her skin prickled with goosebumps, a cold sweat breaking across her brow. Helena shifted almost imperceptibly closer to her, a futile shield. The guard took 2 steps toward them. Zofia could smell the cigarette smoke clinging to his uniform, could see the thread of a recent shave on his jaw. His proximity was terrifying in its normalcy. This man who held their lives in his hands was so mundane, so human in his details. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing as they swept over Zofia's huddled form. Then, without a word, he turned and walked out. The door clanged shut behind him, the key turning with finality. The women remained frozen, waiting for his return, for the shouts, for whatever horror would follow this inspection. But there was only silence, punctuated by their shallow breathing. Minutes passed before anyone dared move. When the sound of boots had completely faded, Helena was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. "We don't have much time," she said, pulling Zofia to her feet with surprising strength for her frail frame. "He knows." The other women gathered around them, forming a tight circle. Their faces were maps of starvation and fear, but something else flickered there now: determination. They had survived this long by forming invisible bonds, by helping each other in small, crucial ways that meant the difference between life and death. Now those bonds would be tested. "If we want to survive, we must be one voice," Helena said, her eyes sweeping the circle. Not a word, not a gesture that could betray her. "When they come, and they will come, we know nothing." The women exchanged glances. What Helena proposed was dangerous beyond measure. Defying the guards meant certain punishment, possibly death. A few nodded immediately. Others hesitated, weighing survival against solidarity. Why should we all die for her mistake? The question came from a thin woman named Elżbieta, her voice cracked from disuse. "They will make examples of us all." Silence followed her words. It was the question they had all considered, but none had voiced until now. Zofia's cheeks burned with shame and fear. Her hand found her belly beneath her ragged dress, the small, firm swell that would soon be impossible to hide. "Because we are still human," Helena answered, her weathered face fierce with conviction. "Because they take everything else, our homes, our families, our dignity. They cannot take our choice to protect one another." Elżbieta looked away, unconvinced but unwilling to argue further. The pact was fragile, hanging by threads of common humanity that grew thinner with each hungry day. Not everyone was ready to sacrifice themselves for Zofia's child. The atmosphere of distrust spread like a subtle plague, invisible but potent. As the day wore on, Zofia felt eyes on her constantly, not just the suspicious glances of guards through the small window in the door, but the evaluating stares of her fellow prisoners. Some looked at her with fear, others with resentment, a few with something like hope. Each woman measured her own survival against the risk Zofia represented. In the makeshift refuge of rags and thin blankets, huddled against the cold stone wall, Zofia traced the subtle curve of her abdomen with trembling fingers. 5 months along, maybe 6, it was becoming harder to hide. The coarse fabric of her dress still concealed her secret, but soon not even the baggiest clothes would disguise the truth. Every kick, every flutter of movement within her was both miracle and threat. Helena settled beside her, joints creaking. Her face was a map of wrinkles, each line earned through years of hardship, even before the camp. She had lost 3 sons to the war and a husband to the first wave of arrests. There was nothing left for her outside these walls, yet she clung to life with fierce determination. "This baby will be our burden and our redemption," she whispered, placing a gnarled hand over Zofia's. There was something almost holy in the gesture, a blessing amid desolation. Zofia swallowed hard, fighting tears. "Why are you helping me? You could save yourself." Helena's laugh was a dry, broken sound. "Save myself for what? Another day of hunger? Another night of cold? No." She shook her head. "This child is proof that even here, even now, life continues. That is worth protecting." Their whispered conversation was interrupted by the distribution of the day's ration. A thin soup with unidentifiable floating bits. barely enough to keep them alive. As always, the women formed an orderly line, accepting their meager portion with downcast eyes. Survival required strict adherence to rules, suppression of any hint of defiance. When it was Zofia's turn, the prisoner serving the soup, a former schoolteacher from Krakow, hesitated, then ladled a slightly larger portion into her bowl. The gesture was small but dangerous. Extra food meant someone else would go with less. Such inequalities could fester into conflict. Across the room, Zofia caught Elżbieta watching the exchange, her hollow eyes calculating. The tension was palpable, a wire pulled taut and ready to snap. At the far end of the cell, a younger prisoner named Irina whispered something to her neighbor, eyes darting nervously toward Zofia and Helena. As night fell, bringing the bitter cold that seemed to seep from the very stones, the women huddled together for warmth, a nightly ritual of survival that transcended personal feelings. Bodies pressed against bodies, sharing what little heat remained in their emaciated frames. In this forced intimacy, secrets became harder to keep. Zofia lay awake long after others had fallen into fitful sleep, listening to the sounds of the prison at night. Distant footsteps, occasional shouts, the soft weeping that always came from somewhere. Her hand rested protectively over her growing child, feeling the subtle movements that reassured her of its life. Each kick was a reminder of what she fought to protect, and what she risked by doing so. Beside her, Helena's breathing had settled into the rhythm of sleep. Beyond her, most of the other women were also unconscious, their faces relaxed from the constant tension of waking hours. But at the far edge of the group, a shadow moved slightly. Irina sat upright, watching Zofia across the darkness. Their eyes met briefly before Irina looked away. "If I tell the guards before it's too late," she whispered, her voice barely audible but clear in the night stillness, "perhaps they'll spare the rest of us." The words hung in the darkness like a blade. The cell had transformed. No longer merely a prison of stone and metal, it had become a theater of invisible warfare. Every glance held meaning, every whisper carried weight. The women moved through their daily routines like actors in a grim play, performing normalcy, while tension crackled beneath the surface. What had once been a united front against their captors was now fractured by suspicion. Trust had become as scarce as the moldy bread they fought not to devour too quickly. In the 3 days since Irina's whispered threat, an uneasy truce had settled over the prisoners. No one spoke of it directly, but the cell had divided into silent factions. Those loyal to Helena and Zofia watched the others carefully, especially Irina, whose thin face had taken on a calculating hardness. The guards, meanwhile, continued their routines, giving no sign that they suspected anything amiss. This uncertainty was its own form of torture. Zofia sat with her back against the damp wall, knees drawn up to conceal her growing belly. The child within her had become more active, as if sensing the danger that surrounded them. Each kick, each rolling movement was a reminder of what was at stake. The war had already taken her husband, her parents, her home in Warsaw. This child was all that remained of her former life, a fragile thread connecting past to future. Helena approached, her movements slow with age and malnutrition. She lowered herself beside Zofia with a soft grunt of pain. The old woman's hands, once strong from years of farm work, now resembled bird claws. Skin stretched tight over bone. But her eyes remained sharp, missing nothing. "We're being watched," she murmured, arranging her ragged shawl. "Not just by the guards." Zofia nodded slightly. She had felt the scrutiny, the calculating stares of women weighing their own survival against hers. The war had stripped away social niceties, leaving only raw instinct. She couldn't blame them for their fear. "What do we do?" Helena's cracked lips twitched in what might have been a smile. "We survive, one day at a time." She leaned closer, her breath warm against Zofia's ear. "Trust no one completely, not even me." The words sent a chill down Zofia's spine. Helena had been her protector, her confidant. To hear such a warning from her only underscored the peril of their situation. The war had already torn away everything external. Now it was eroding trust itself, the final possession of the dispossessed. Night fell early, casting the cell into shadow. The winter darkness was a mixed blessing. It concealed Zofia's condition but brought bone-deep cold that made her teeth chatter. The women huddled together for warmth. Temporary alliances formed against the freezing air. In these moments of forced intimacy, Zofia could feel the reluctance in some bodies pressed against hers, the slight pulling away that spoke of fear and suspicion. A sudden creak of wood startled her from half-sleep. Her eyes snapped open, scanning the darkness. The dim moonlight filtering through the barred window revealed a figure moving stealthily across the floor. Zofia's heart hammered against her ribs as the shadow approached her corner. She recognized the slight frame, the furtive movements. Marta, a quiet woman who had said little since her arrival 3 weeks ago. Marta's hands moved deftly, searching through the small pile of rags that served as Zofia's bed. The invasion was so unexpected, so brazen, that for a moment Zofia could only watch in stunned silence. Then anger flared, hot and sudden. "What are you looking for?" Zofia asked, her voice trembling but clear in the stillness. Marta froze, caught in the act. Her eyes widened, reflecting the pale moonlight like a cornered animal's. She recoiled from Zofia's space, hands empty but guilt evident in every line of her body. I thought you might have extra bread," she stammered, the lie transparent between them. They both knew what Marta had really been searching for: evidence, confirmation of the secret that could be traded for favor or extra rations. The realization settled like ice in Zofia's stomach. The betrayal wasn't just possible, it was imminent. Someone would eventually decide that their own survival outweighed Zofia's, that exposing her secret was worth whatever small mercy the guards might offer in return. Marta scuttled back to her own corner without another word. But the damage was done. The night air seemed to vibrate with new tension. Several women had awakened during the exchange, watching silently from their makeshift beds. Judgments were being formed, alliances shifted. By morning, everyone would know of Marta's attempted betrayal and what it meant for their fragile community. Helena's eyes met Zofia's across the darkness, conveying a wordless understanding. The clock was ticking faster now. Dawn brought the usual routines: the counting of prisoners, the distribution of thin gruel that passed for breakfast, the emptying of the single bucket that served as their toilet. But beneath these familiar patterns ran an undercurrent of heightened awareness. Every sound from the corridor made the women stiffen. Every appearance of a guard at the door sent waves of anxiety through the cell. The guards selected several women for work detail that morning, cleaning the officers' quarters or sorting through confiscated belongings in the warehouse. It was grueling labor on empty stomachs, but it offered brief escape from the cell's confines and sometimes opportunities for scraps of food or useful items that could be smuggled back. Marta's name was called. Before stepping into the corridor, she turned back toward the cell, her gaze finding Zofia. The look lasted only seconds, but contained volumes. There was calculation there, perhaps fear, perhaps something more complex: envy, hatred, desperation. It was impossible to read the true intent behind those hollow eyes. "She knows too much," Helena whispered once the door had closed behind Marta. The other women gathered around, huddling close to hear the old woman's words. "If she speaks to a guard—" "We should stop her," Elżbieta interjected, her voice hard. The implication hung in the air, terrible in its simplicity. Zofia shook her head vehemently. "No, we're not them." She placed her hand protectively over her belly. "This child won't be born from more bloodshed." The group fell silent, the moral weight of the situation settling over them. They had been ordinary women once, teachers, shopkeepers, mothers, daughters. The camp had forced them into impossible choices, testing the boundaries of their humanity daily. But this, deliberate harm to one of their own, would cross a line from which there might be no return. The hours crawled by, each minute stretched by anticipation. The women moved through their confined space like ghosts, speaking little, watching the door. Zofia felt her child move within her, a flutter of life amid so much death. She wondered what world this baby would be born into, if it would be born at all. The thought brought a rush of fierce protectiveness that surprised her with its intensity. After months of numb survival, the sharp edge of this emotion was almost painful. When the key finally turned in the lock again, the sound cut through the cell like a physical blow. The women tensed collectively, eyes fixed on the opening door. Marta entered first, her face unreadable, her thin body seeming smaller than when she had left. But it was the figure behind her that froze the blood in their veins, a guard, tall and impassive, his hand resting casually on his holstered weapon. The silence in the cell was absolute, a vacuum of sound in which Zofia could hear only the rushing of blood in her ears. Time seemed to stop as the guard surveyed the room, his gaze moving methodically from face to face. Had Marta spoken? Had she traded Zofia's secret for some small mercy? The question hung unasked in the stale air. The guard's eyes finally reached Zofia, lingering there with unsettling intensity. She fought the urge to cover her belly, to give herself away with a protective gesture. Instead, she stared back, summoning defiance from some deep reserve she hadn't known she possessed. For a moment that stretched like eternity, no one moved. Then, without a word, the guard stepped back into the corridor. The door swung shut with a finality that echoed through the cell, the lock engaging with a metallic click that sounded unnervingly like fate sealing itself. Marta stood alone now, isolated by suspicion. In her hand was a small piece of bread, darker and less moldy than their usual rations. The evidence of her transaction was damning in its simplicity. The silence that followed was more suffocating than any accusation could have been. The guard's cold stare had left a chill in the air that lingered long after he was gone. 20 pairs of eyes fixed on Marta, who stood clutching her piece of bread as if it were both salvation and damnation. No one spoke. The only sounds were shallow breathing and the distant echo of boots in faraway corridors. Time seemed suspended, each second stretched to breaking point. Marta took a tentative step forward, then stopped as the women around her instinctively recoiled. The division was clear now, a physical manifestation of the distrust that had been growing for days. Zofia pressed herself against the wall, one hand hovering protectively near her abdomen. She searched Marta's face for any clue of what had transpired outside the cell, what words might have been exchanged with the guard. Helena broke the suffocating silence. She rose to her feet with deliberate slowness, her frail body somehow commanding the space as she approached Marta. Though stooped with age and starvation, there was steel in the old woman's bearing. "Did you betray any of us?" she asked, her voice low but carrying to every corner of the cell. The question was direct, unadorned by pleasantries that no longer had a place in their world. Marta's gaze fell to the floor, then lifted with unexpected defiance. A bitter laugh escaped her cracked lips. "Or maybe I just know how to negotiate better than the rest of you." She tore off a piece of the bread and stuffed it in her mouth, the gesture almost aggressive in its deliberateness. Helena didn't flinch. "Answer the question." "Why should I?" Marta countered, her voice hardening. "You've already decided I'm guilty." Her eyes swept the room, taking in the suspicious glares. "Look at yourselves, ready to condemn me while you protect her." She jerked her chin toward Zofia. "Her secret will kill us all eventually." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. No one denied them. It was a truth they had all considered in the dark hours of the night, when survival stripped away niceties and left only raw calculation. Elżbieta stepped forward, her gaunt face tight with anger. "What did you tell the guard? We deserve to know what's coming." Marta smiled, a terrible thing on her starved face. "Perhaps nothing. Perhaps everything." She took another bite of bread, chewing slowly. "Perhaps I've earned us all an extra ration for good behavior." The ambiguity was torturous. Zofia felt her heart hammering against her ribs. She couldn't tell if Marta was taunting them or providing a cover story. The uncertainty itself was a form of power, the only kind available to prisoners who had been stripped of everything else. As night fell, the temperature in the cell plummeted. The women arranged themselves in their usual sleeping formation, bodies pressed together for warmth, personal space a luxury none could afford. But tonight, the pattern had shifted subtly. Marta found herself isolated at the edge of the group, a small but deliberate gap separating her from the others. She said nothing about this silent punishment, merely wrapped her thin arms around herself and turned to face the wall. Zofia lay awake, her mind racing through possible scenarios, If Marta had revealed her secret, how long before the guards acted on the information? Would they take her away immediately, or wait to see if other forbidden pregnancies were being concealed? The Nazis were nothing if not methodical in their cruelty. They might use her as an example to the others, a lesson in the futility of defiance. She placed both hands on her swollen abdomen, feeling the subtle movements within. The child was active tonight, as if sensing her distress. Each kick, each rolling motion was a miracle that defied the death surrounding them. Zofia had stopped praying months ago when her family was taken, but now she found herself whispering wordless pleas to whoever might be listening. Not for herself. She had accepted her likely fate, but for this innocent life that had no part in the world's madness. Helena's voice came softly through the darkness. "Try to sleep," she murmured. "Tomorrow will bring what it brings." The old woman's fatalism should have been frightening, but Zofia found it oddly comforting. There was dignity in facing the inevitable without illusion. She closed her eyes, letting her breathing slow to match Helena's steady rhythm beside her. Morning arrived with harsh light and the usual sounds, guards shouting in the corridor, the metallic clanking of buckets being distributed for the day's meager rations. Zofia woke with a start, momentarily surprised to find herself still in the cell. Each morning brought the same brief shock, that she had survived another night, that the reckoning had been postponed yet again. The daily count proceeded as usual. Guards walked through, tallying lives with the same detachment they might count livestock. Zofia kept her eyes down, her posture carefully arranged to disguise the swell of her belly. She could feel Marta watching her from across the cell but didn't dare meet her gaze. When the guards departed, the women resumed their daily routines, such as they were. Some picked lice from each other's hair, others mended tears in their threadbare clothing with scraps of string. These small acts of normality were a form of resistance, a refusal to surrender completely to despair. Zofia sat with her back against the wall, legs drawn up. Helena joined her, their shoulders touching in silent solidarity. They watched as Marta isolated herself in a corner, picking at the remaining crumbs of her special ration. The tension between them stretched like a wire pulled taut. "She's playing with us," Helena whispered, "using our fear against us." Zofia nodded slightly. "But why? What does she gain?" "Power," Helena replied simply. "When you have nothing left, making others afraid of you is a kind of power." The day wore on, marked only by the changing angle of light through the barred window and the growing pangs of hunger that none of them acknowledged aloud. The afternoon ration came, thin soup with bits of potato skin floating on the surface. The women accepted their portions without complaint, having learned long ago that protest only invited punishment. As Zofia sipped her soup, trying to make it last, she felt a sharp, sudden pain lance through her abdomen. She gasped, the bowl nearly slipping from her hands. Helena steadied her, concern etched in the deep lines of her face. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Nothing," Zofia managed, forcing her expression to neutrality. "Just a cramp." But it wasn't nothing, and they both knew it. At 6 months pregnant, perhaps closer to 7, her body was responding to starvation and stress in ways that threatened both her and the child. She had seen it happen to other women, before they were taken away. The human body could endure only so much before it began to protect itself at the expense of new life. Across the cell, Marta watched this exchange with unnerving intensity. Her hollow eyes missed nothing, cataloging each wince, each protective gesture. When the evening count came, she stood a little straighter, her gaze following the guard who had accompanied her return the previous day. He paused at Zofia, his cold stare lingering a moment too long. Was there recognition there? Some flicker of awareness that hadn't been present before? Zofia forced herself to meet his eyes, to show nothing on her face but the same dull submission expected of all prisoners. It took every ounce of strength she possessed. When the guards departed, the tension in the cell had ratcheted higher. The women moved closer to Zofia, forming a protective circle without explicitly acknowledging what they were doing. Even those who had kept their distance before seemed to have chosen sides now. Whatever Marta might have said, or not said, had crystallized their fragile community into two clear factions. As night fell once more, Zofia felt another sharp pain, stronger than before. She bit her lip to keep from crying out, tasting blood. Helena's hand found hers in the darkness, squeezing tightly. "It's coming, isn't it?" the old woman whispered. Zofia could only nod, fear clutching at her throat. It was too soon. The baby couldn't possibly survive, and her chances were little better. Birth in these conditions was a death sentence for both of them. "Not yet," she whispered back, as much a prayer as a statement. "It can't be yet." But her body had its own wisdom, its own timeline. Another pain gripped her, this one lasting longer. She trembled with the effort of remaining silent, sweat beading on her forehead despite the cold. "Helena," she gasped when the contraction had passed. "If I don't." The older woman cut her off firmly. "Save your strength." In the far corner, Marta shifted in the darkness, her eyes reflecting the faint moonlight, watching, waiting. Her expression remained unreadable, but there was a new tension in her posture, an alertness that hadn't been there before. The night stretched endlessly ahead, each minute a battle against pain and fear. Zofia drifted in and out of consciousness, her dreams tangled with waking terror. She saw her husband's face, heard her mother's voice, felt the warmth of the home she would never see again. When she opened her eyes again, Marta was standing over her. The night air sliced through the cell like a blade, turning breath to vapor and skin to ice. Zofia stared up at Marta's silhouette looming above her, unable to make out her expression in the darkness. Time seemed suspended as they regarded each other, the betrayer and the betrayed, both victims in different ways. Zofia's hand instinctively moved to shield her belly, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed. "How long?" Marta whispered, her voice surprisingly gentle. Before Zofia could answer, another contraction seized her body. She bit down hard on her lower lip to stifle a cry, tasting blood. The pain was different now, more insistent, more purposeful. This wasn't a warning. It was the beginning. Helena stirred beside them, instantly alert despite her age. "What are you doing here?" she hissed at Marta, positioning herself protectively in front of Zofia. Marta crouched down, her movements deliberate and silent. "It's starting, isn't it?" She ignored Helena's hostility, focusing solely on Zofia. "I was a midwife. Before." The simple statement hung in the air between them. Before. That single word encompassed everything. Before the war, before the camps, before humanity had been stripped away layer by layer until only survival remained. It was an offering of sorts, a piece of herself surrendered. Helena's suspicion was palpable. "Convenient timing for you to remember." "I never forgot." Marta's voice hardened. "But skills are currency here. You don't share what you don't have to." Another contraction gripped Zofia, stronger than the last. She couldn't suppress the small moan that escaped her lips, the sound terrifyingly loud in the silent cell. Several women nearby stirred, waking to the crisis unfolding in their midst. "We need to move her away from the door," Marta whispered urgently. "The night patrol passes every 20 minutes. Helena hesitated, torn between distrust and necessity. Zofia made the decision for her, grasping Marta's offered hand and allowing herself to be helped to the darkest corner of the cell. The movement sent fresh waves of pain through her body, each step an exercise in silent agony. Word spread through the cell with remarkable speed, communicated through whispers and subtle gestures. Within minutes, the women had reorganized themselves. Those nearest the door positioned themselves to block the view inside, bodies arranged in seemingly casual sleeping poses that would reveal nothing to passing guards. Others gathered blankets and scraps of clothing, creating a makeshift birthing area shielded from sight. Zofia watched this coordinated effort through a haze of pain, marveling at how quickly former suspicions had been set aside in the face of immediate crisis. Even those who had kept their distance were now part of this conspiracy of survival. Perhaps it was the concrete reality of the child, no longer an abstract risk but an imminent life, that unified them. Or perhaps it was simply that in this one act, they could defy the machinery of death that surrounded them. The cold might work in our favor. Marta murmured as she examined Zofia with practiced hands. "It slows bleeding." She glanced at Helena. "We need water, clean as possible." Helena nodded and slipped away to retrieve their meager rations of drinking water, hoarded from the day's allocation. Another woman silently offered a relatively clean undershirt, one of the few personal possessions she had managed to keep. It would serve as swaddling for the child, if it survived. The contractions intensified, coming faster now. Zofia bit down on a rolled cloth to stifle her cries, her body rigid with the effort of silence. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the biting cold, trickling down her temples like tears. Marta worked with quiet efficiency, her hollow face set in lines of concentration as she monitored the progress of labor. "When the urge to push comes, you must fight it," she whispered to Zofia. "Wait until I tell you. Too soon and you'll tear badly." Zofia nodded, beyond words now. The pain consumed her world, narrowing it to this corner, these women, this moment that balanced between life and death. She thought fleetingly of her husband, taken in the first raids 2 years ago. Would the child have his eyes, his stubborn chin? These questions seemed both vitally important and utterly insignificant as another contraction ripped through her. A sudden noise from the corridor froze everyone in place. Boots on concrete, the jingle of keys, the night patrol earlier than expected. The women near the door immediately adjusted their positions, creating a human shield. Those around Zofia hunched lower, using their bodies to conceal what was happening. Marta pressed a firm hand over Zofia's mouth, her eyes conveying an unmistakable message: absolute silence or death for all. The patrol paused outside their cell. A beam of light swept through the bars, illuminating sleeping forms and blank walls. Zofia felt a contraction building and fought against it with every ounce of her remaining strength, her scream trapped behind Marta's palm. The light lingered for what seemed an eternity before moving on. The sound of retreating footsteps was the sweetest music Zofia had ever heard. "They're suspicious," Helena whispered when the danger had passed. "That wasn't the regular pattern." Marta nodded grimly. "We need to hurry. The next round might be more thorough." As if in response to the urgency, Zofia's labor intensified. The pain was no longer coming in waves, but had become a constant, overwhelming force. Marta positioned herself between Zofia's legs, her movements sure despite the near darkness. "Now," she commanded softly. "Push with the next one." Zofia bore down, channeling her pain into purpose. The women around her murmured encouragement, soft as breath. Some prayed in whispered Polish, others simply held her hands, offering what little strength they had to give. In this moment, all divisions were forgotten. They were bound together in this most fundamental of human acts, bringing life into the world against all odds. The minutes stretched into an hour, marked by stifled groans and the constant fear of discovery. Zofia's strength was failing, her body pushed beyond endurance by months of starvation and the demands of childbirth. Darkness edged her vision, tempting her to surrender to unconsciousness. Only Marta's insistent voice kept her anchored to the painful present. Again, one more. "I can see the head." With a final, monumental effort, Zofia pushed. She felt a rushing sensation, an unbearable pressure, and then sudden release. The pain receded like a tide, leaving exhaustion in its wake. Through the ringing in her ears, she heard a new sound. Tiny, mewling, impossibly alive. Marta worked quickly, clearing the baby's airways, tying off the umbilical cord with thread unraveled from a blanket. The child, a boy, impossibly small but perfectly formed, was wrapped in the donated undershirt and placed on Zofia's chest. His cries were immediately muffled against her skin, a sound that could mean death if heard beyond their circle. The women gathered closer, tears streaming down hollowed cheeks as they beheld this miracle in their midst. The child represented everything they had lost and everything they still hoped for: family, future, normality. His tiny fingers flexed against Zofia's skin, his face scrunched in the universal expression of newborn indignation. Helena gently touched the baby's head, her weathered hand trembling. "He is the proof that life still exists," she whispered, echoing her words from days earlier. But now they weren't just a promise. They were reality, embodied in this small, defiant life. Zofia gazed down at her son, memorizing every detail of his face. In this moment, despite the danger and pain, she felt a fierce joy that transcended their desperate circumstances. They had accomplished the impossible, created life in a place dedicated to death. The spell was broken by approaching footsteps, heavier this time, purposeful. The women exchanged alarmed glances. This wasn't the regular patrol returning. It was something else. Someone had heard, or suspected. The baby, sensing the tension or perhaps just hungry, began to cry more insistently. Zofia tried to soothe him, offering her breast, but the newborn's frustration only grew. His cries, though tiny, seemed to fill the entire cell with damning evidence. Marta made a swift decision, grabbing Helena's shawl and creating a small tent over mother and child. "Feed him quickly," she instructed. "It might quiet him." The other women resumed their protective positions, some moving toward the door to intercept whatever was coming. Zofia's hands shook as she guided her son to her breast, praying he would latch on quickly. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied now by the unmistakable sound of a key being fitted into the lock. The metallic echo of the turning key seemed to reverberate through the cell, a sound as final as a coffin being sealed. The baby's cries softened as he found what he sought, but it might already be too late. The door swung open, spilling harsh light into their sanctuary. The cell door crashed against the wall with brutal finality. A beam of light cut through the darkness, sweeping across huddled forms before settling on the corner where the women had gathered. The guard stood silhouetted in the doorway, his face in shadow but his stance radiating suspicion. Every woman held her breath, bodies frozen in a tableau of terror. Zofia pressed deeper into the corner, her child clutched against her chest beneath Helena's shawl, her heart pounding so violently she was certain it would betray her. The guard stepped into the cell, his boots echoing against the stone floor. Each footfall was like a hammer driving nails into their collective coffin. His flashlight beam danced across faces, lingering on the unusual clustering of women in the corner. The light was merciless, exposing their gaunt features, the fear that no amount of practiced blankness could fully conceal. Zofia's entire world narrowed to the tiny being against her skin. The baby had quieted momentarily, sated by his first meal, but she knew this reprieve was temporary. Newborns were unpredictable, driven by needs they couldn't suppress. One cry would end everything. The guard moved closer, clearly sensing something amiss in the women's arrangement. His light swept over their huddled forms, searching for the source of his unease. The silence stretched, taut as a wire about to snap. Then, just as he took another step toward Zofia's corner, something unexpected happened. Marta moved forward, placing herself directly in the guard's path. There was nothing threatening in her stance. That would have meant immediate punishment. Instead, she adopted a posture of servility, head slightly bowed, eyes downcast in the expected manner of prisoners addressing their captors. But her positioning was deliberate, blocking his direct line of sight to Zofia. "We were praying, sir," she said, her voice steady despite the risk she was taking. "For those who were taken to the medical block yesterday." The guard studied her face, suspicion evident in the tightening of his jaw. Speaking without being addressed first was a punishable offense. Every woman in the cell knew this, had witnessed the consequences. Yet Marta stood her ground, gaze respectfully lowered but body unyielding. "Prayers?" the guard repeated, his German accent thick around the Polish word. "Since when do rats pray?" His contempt was a familiar thing, almost comforting in its predictability. This, at least, was a danger they understood. Zofia held her breath as the guard's flashlight beam played over Marta's face, searching for the lie. Behind the shawl, she felt her baby stir against her chest, tiny limbs stretching in the instinctive movements of newborns. "Please," she silently begged, pressing her lips to the top of her son's head through the fabric. "Please stay quiet." The guard took another step forward, close enough now that Marta would have to move aside or be shoved. The moment balanced on a knife's edge. Then, from somewhere in the corridor came a shout in German. The guard hesitated, his head turning toward the sound. Some commotion was unfolding elsewhere in the prison, perhaps another inspection, perhaps punishment being meted out. He barked a response, then turned back to the women. His gaze swept over them once more, lingering on their huddled forms with naked suspicion. But whatever was happening outside demanded his attention. With a final warning glare, he backed toward the door. "No prayers," he said flatly. "Animals don't need God." The door slammed shut, the lock engaging with a sound that resonated through the stone cell. For several long moments, no one moved or spoke. They listened to his retreating footsteps, hardly daring to believe in their reprieve. Only when the corridor had fallen silent did the collective breath they'd been holding release in a soft rush of air. Marta sagged against the wall, the courage that had held her spine straight suddenly evaporating. Helena moved to her side, supporting her with a strength that belied her frail appearance. The two women exchanged a look of shared understanding, enemies turned allies by circumstance. "Thank you," Helena said simply. Marta nodded once, her eyes shifting to where Zofia sat cradling her newborn. "It won't work twice," she warned. "They'll be back, and next time they'll search more thoroughly." The temporary relief that had washed over the cell receded, replaced by the cold reality of their situation. The baby was born, alive against all odds, but his very existence remained a death sentence. His needs, for food, for warmth, for the basic comfort of being held, could not be suppressed or hidden indefinitely. Each cry was a betrayal waiting to happen. Zofia looked down at her son, now revealed as she carefully pulled away the shawl. In the dim moonlight filtering through the barred window, his face was a study in miniature perfection. Impossibly long eyelashes rested against cheeks still flushed from the effort of being born. His tiny fist was curled against her breast, fingers like delicate seashells. How could something so small pose such enormous danger? "We have to decide," Helena said, voicing the thought they had all been avoiding. "Do we protect the child, or do we surrender him?" The words hung in the air, terrible in their pragmatism. No one rushed to answer. Each woman wrestled with the implications. The moral calculus of one life weighed against 23. Even those who had been most supportive throughout Zofia's pregnancy now faced the stark reality of what harboring this child truly meant. Elżbieta, who had been skeptical from the beginning, spoke first. "We cannot all die for one baby." Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion, not cruel but simply stating what seemed to her an obvious truth. "The guards will punish everyone if they discover him. You know this." Several women nodded in grim agreement. They had seen such collective punishment before: rations withheld, beatings administered, prisoners executed as examples. The Nazis believed in shared guilt, in breaking solidarity through fear. "So we just give him up?" another woman asked, her voice cracking. "Hand him over to die?" "He might not die," Elżbieta countered. "Sometimes they send the babies elsewhere." It was a thin hope, everyone knew. The Nazis had little use for Jewish or Polish infants. Those not immediately killed were often subjected to experiments or sent to German families, erased of their heritage, their identities stolen along with their lives. Zofia listened to this debate over her son's fate with a curious detachment, as if it were happening to someone else. The exhaustion of childbirth combined with months of starvation had left her in a state beyond fear. She gazed down at the miracle in her arms and knew with absolute certainty that she would die before surrendering him. It wasn't a decision made through reason or calculation. It was as fundamental as breathing. "His name is Alexander," she said softly, interrupting the increasingly heated discussion. "After my father." The simple declaration silenced the room. A name made the child real in a new way, not just a problem to be solved, but a person with an identity, a connection to the world outside these walls. Several women blinked back tears. Even Elżbieta's expression softened momentarily. "Alexander," Helena repeated, placing a weathered hand on the baby's head in a gesture that was half caress, half blessing. "Welcome to a hard world, little fighter." As if in response to his name, the baby began to stir again. His face scrunched in the universal expression of newborn displeasure, tiny mouth opening in preparation for a cry. Zofia quickly offered her breast again, but this time he seemed unsatisfied. His whimpers grew louder, edging toward a full-throated wail. The women exchanged panicked glances. The guard could return at any moment, especially if alerted by unusual sounds. Marta moved swiftly to Zofia's side, examining the baby with practiced eyes. "He's too cold," she diagnosed. "Newborns can't regulate their temperature. We need more blankets." Without hesitation, several women removed their own threadbare coverings, sacrificing what little protection they had against the frigid night air. The garments were layered around mother and child, creating a nest of relative warmth. Marta showed Zofia how to hold Alexander skin to skin beneath her dress. Their shared body heat the most effective defense against the cold. The baby's cries subsided gradually as he warmed, but the danger remained acute. Every woman in the cell now understood the impossible choice before them: protect this new life and risk their own, or surrender him and survive with the knowledge of what they had done. Marta settled beside Zofia, her gaunt face set in lines of determination. "We have until morning count," she said quietly. "By then, we must decide." Helena looked around the cell, meeting each woman's eyes in turn. Some looked away, unable to bear the weight of the moment. Others held her gaze, their expressions a complex mixture of fear, resignation, and resolve. The collective breath of 23 women seemed to hang in the air, visible in the cold as a testament to their tenuous grip on life. Then, from somewhere beyond their stone prison, came the unmistakable sound of a child crying. Another baby, in another cell, or perhaps the medical block. The sound drifted through the night, a ghostly reminder that they were not the first to face this terrible dilemma, nor would they be the last. Zofia clutched her son tighter, his small body the only warmth in a world gone cold. Dawn approached with excruciating slowness, each minute dragging as if weighted with lead. The women had arranged themselves in protective formation around Zofia and baby Alexander, a human fortress against discovery. No one had slept. Eyes remained fixed on the cell door, ears strained for approaching footsteps. Every distant sound, a shout, a door slamming, the bark of guard dogs in the yard, sent ripples of tension through their huddled forms. Zofia drifted in and out of consciousness, her body pushed beyond endurance by childbirth and months of starvation. In her lucid moments, she marveled at the perfect tiny being nestled against her chest. Alexander slept fitfully, his face occasionally scrunching with displeasure before settling again. Each time he stirred, 23 women held their collective breath, silently willing him to remain quiet. The first hint of approaching daylight filtered through the barred window, not true light, but merely a lessening of darkness. With it came the sounds of the camp awakening, distant shouting in German, the rumble of vehicles, the metallic clanging that signaled the morning count would soon begin. Their temporary sanctuary was about to be invaded. "He needs to be hidden," Marta whispered, her voice barely audible even in the stillness. "The count will come soon." Helena nodded grimly. They had debated through the night, weighing impossible choices, but had reached no consensus. Some argued for surrendering the child, hoping for mercy that experience told them would not come. Others insisted they must protect him at all costs. Now, time had run out. A decision had to be made. "There's a loose stone in the back wall," whispered an older woman who rarely spoke. "Behind it, a small hollow. I found it weeks ago." All eyes turned to her in surprise. Information was currency in the camp. Secrets like this were rarely shared. The woman, Anna, a former librarian from Warsaw, shrugged slightly at their questioning looks. "I was saving it for myself when it became too much." No one needed elaboration. They had all contemplated ending their suffering when it became unbearable. That Anna had found a potential escape route and kept it to herself was not judged. Survival had taught them all to harbor secrets. "Show us," Helena commanded. Anna led them to the back corner of the cell, where years of dampness had weakened the mortar between stones. With fingers raw from cold and work, she demonstrated how one particular stone could be worked free, revealing a space just large enough for a small bundle or a newborn baby. Zofia stared at the dark hollow, her arms tightening instinctively around her son. "He'll suffocate," she protested, voice cracking with exhaustion and fear. Not if we do it right, Marta countered, professional assessment overtaking emotion. Newborns need less oxygen than you think. With small gaps for air, it could work. For the count, at least. The debate was cut short by a distant explosion that shook the very foundations of the prison. Dust rained down from the ceiling as the women clutched at each other for balance. A second blast followed, then a third, each closer than the last. The sound of gunfire erupted, not the controlled volley of an execution squad, but the chaotic exchange of combat. "What's happening?" someone whispered, fear and hope mingling in her voice. No one answered. None of them dared voice the possibility that had sprung to all their minds. They had lived too long with disappointment to embrace hope easily. More explosions followed, accompanied by shouting that held a note of panic rather than the usual coldness of command. The guards were frightened, a concept so alien it took the women a moment to comprehend it. Through the high window, they could see an orange glow against the pre-dawn sky. Something was burning. "The Allies," Helena finally breathed, her lined face transformed by a fierce joy. "They're coming." As if in confirmation, the distinctive sound of airplane engines roared overhead, followed by the whistle and crash of bombs. The entire building shook, mortar dust sifting down from the ceiling in ghostly veils. Baby Alexander woke with a start, his cry piercing the cell before Zofia could quiet him. But now, amid the chaos unfolding outside, one infant's wail seemed insignificant. The sound of keys rattling frantically in locks echoed down the corridor. Cell doors were being opened, not with the methodical precision of morning count, but with desperate haste. Orders were shouted in German, voices tight with fear. The guards were evacuating the prison. "They're running," Elżbieta said in disbelief, "leaving us to die here." The realization struck them all simultaneously. The Nazis would not allow prisoners to be liberated, witnesses to their atrocities, evidence of their crimes. The prison was to be their tomb. When their own cell door remained closed as footsteps retreated down the corridor, the women understood their fate had been sealed. They were to be abandoned, left to burn or starve behind locked doors while their captors fled the advancing Allied forces. Helena, who had survived the ghetto clearances and 2 years in various camps, moved to the door with surprising agility. "Listen to me," she commanded, her voice stronger than it had been in months. "If they're running, it means freedom is close. We must be ready." The women gathered around her, drawing strength from her certainty. Even those who had been most afraid now stood straighter, faces set with newfound determination. Death had been their shadow companion for so long that the prospect of fighting it, even futilely, felt like liberation. The building shook again with another explosion, this one close enough to crack one of the cell walls. Debris fell from the ceiling, forcing the women to shield themselves and baby Alexander. The prison was being destroyed around them. Whether by Allied bombs or German sabotage was impossible to know. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the chaos, the unmistakable rattle of machine gun fire, but different from the German weapons they had grown accustomed to hearing. This was followed by shouting in English, harsh, urgent commands that none of them understood, but which carried a note that had been absent from their world for too long: righteous anger. The gunfire intensified, moving closer. Explosions punctuated the staccato bursts, the sound of doors being breached by force. The women pressed against the far wall of their cell, Zofia and the baby at the center of their protective circle. They had no way of knowing if these new invaders would be saviors or simply a different kind of enemy. The corridor outside their cell erupted in gunfire, the sound deafening in the confined space. German shouts were cut short, followed by the heavy thud of bodies falling. Then came the sound of boots, different from the precise march of SS guards, more urgent, more human. The lock on their cell door was shot off in a shower of sparks and twisted metal. The door swung open, revealing figures silhouetted against the smoke-filled corridor. Men in unfamiliar uniforms, weapons raised, faces grim with the business of war. For a moment, neither group moved. The soldiers stared at the women in shock, clearly unprepared for what they had found. The prisoners stared back, unable to process the reality of potential freedom after so long in captivity. It was as if two separate worlds had collided, neither quite believing in the existence of the other. The first soldier to step forward lowered his weapon slowly. His face, young beneath the grime of battle, registered horror as he took in their emaciated forms, their ragged clothes, the desperation etched into every feature. He said something in English, then tried again in halting German. When this produced no response, he gestured toward the door, toward freedom, his meaning clear despite the language barrier. The women hesitated, years of conditioning making them suspicious of any kindness. Was this another trick? Another form of torment? It seemed impossible that salvation could arrive so suddenly, so completely, after so much suffering. It was Helena who moved first, her gnarled hand reaching out to touch the soldier's uniform, confirming his solidity. "Americans," she whispered in Polish, recognition dawning. "They've come." The spell broke. The women began to move toward the door, supporting each other, those with more strength helping those who could barely stand. Zofia remained in the center of their group. Alexander clutched tightly to her chest, no longer hidden but held proudly despite the danger that had defined his entire brief existence. When the American soldiers saw the baby, their expressions transformed from grim determination to profound shock. One of them, older than the rest, with stripes on his uniform indicating rank, stepped forward, his weathered face softening as he gazed at the impossibly tiny life in Zofia's arms. "My God," he said, the words clear despite the language difference. "How did this baby survive in here?" The question needed no translation. It hung in the air between them, a bridge connecting two worlds, those who had endured the unendurable, and those who were only now comprehending the depth of human cruelty they had come to end. Outside the cell, the prison was in chaos. The sounds of battle continued in distant sections of the compound. But here, in this moment, there was only wonder at the resilience of life in the face of systematic death. The journey from cell to courtyard unfolded like a dream. Each step carried Zofia further from darkness into a world she had almost forgotten existed. Sunlight, harsh and unfiltered, struck her face for the first time in months, without the barrier of barred windows. The sensation was almost painful, her eyes watering as they adjusted to the brightness. Around her, the other women moved with similar caution, as if expecting the ground to dissolve beneath their feet, the reality of freedom too fragile to trust. The prison compound had been transformed into a battlefield. Smoke billowed from buildings set ablaze during the fighting. The administrative block where the commandant had kept his meticulous records was now a charred skeleton, papers floating like macabre confetti in the morning breeze. American soldiers moved purposefully through the chaos, securing buildings, treating wounded, documenting evidence of atrocities with grim-faced determination. Zofia clutched baby Alexander to her chest, one hand protectively cradling his head. The newborn, bewildered by the sudden assault of light, sound, and motion, whimpered against her skin. She whispered soothing words in Polish, promises she wasn't certain she could keep, but needed to voice nonetheless. "You're safe now. We're free. I'll never let anyone hurt you." Helena shuffled beside her, the old woman's face upturned to the sky, as if reacquainting herself with the concept of horizon after so long in confinement. Tears streamed unchecked down her hollow cheeks, cutting clean paths through the grime of captivity. "I never thought I would see the sun again," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. The other women formed a protective circle around mother and child, a habit of solidarity that freedom had not yet erased. Marta, whose betrayal had been forgotten in the crucible of childbirth and liberation, kept one hand on Zofia's elbow, steadying her when her steps faltered. Elżbieta, who had argued most fervently for pragmatism over protection, now walked ahead, clearing a path through the debris with fierce determination. They were led to a clearing where American medics had established a field station. Other prisoners, men from a separate compound, some in striped uniforms, others in civilian rags, were already being treated, their skeletal frames shocking evidence of systematic starvation. The women moved as a unit, unwilling to be separated even for medical attention. When a well-meaning soldier tried to direct Zofia to a separate examination area, 22 voices rose in unison, refusing the division. A young medic approached, his face betraying momentary shock at their condition before professional composure reasserted itself. "Does anyone speak English?" he asked, glancing from face to face. Helena stepped forward. "A little," she answered in heavily accented English. "From before war." The medic nodded, relief evident. "We need to check the baby and mother first," he explained slowly, gesturing toward Zofia. "Then all of you. Food, medicine." Helena translated, and after a brief discussion, the women agreed to allow Zofia and Alexander to be examined. But they refused to move more than a few feet away, forming a perimeter around the examination area. Trust was a luxury they could not yet afford, even toward their liberators. The medic worked with gentle efficiency, his touch clinical but kind as he checked Alexander's vital signs. "The baby appears remarkably healthy considering," he told Helena, who translated for the group. "But both mother and child need proper nutrition immediately. We'll arrange transport to a field hospital." Food arrived, not the watery soup and moldy bread that had sustained them on the edge of starvation, but real provisions from American supplies. Canned meat, crackers, powdered milk mixed with clean water. The women ate slowly, painfully aware that their shrunken stomachs could not handle sudden abundance. Some wept silently as they chewed, the simple act of eating without fear overwhelming in its normalcy. A female interpreter arrived, her Polish fluent if formally academic. Through her, the Americans began to gather information, names, hometowns, how long they had been imprisoned. The women answered mechanically, still processing the abrupt transition from condemned to liberated. When asked how they had managed to keep a newborn alive and hidden, they exchanged glances loaded with shared history. "We became his family," Helena finally answered, her weathered hand resting on Zofia's shoulder. "All of us." The interpreter's eyes glistened as she translated this simple statement. The American officer taking notes paused, pen hovering above paper, struck by the profound weight of those 5 words. As the day progressed, more prisoners were brought to the clearing. Some recognized friends or relatives thought long dead, creating scenes of reunion so raw with emotion that even the battle-hardened soldiers looked away to grant privacy. Others received confirmation of losses they had long suspected but couldn't verify, their grief finally given the certainty needed for mourning to begin. Zofia sat apart from these dramas, focused entirely on Alexander. The baby had been washed, examined, and wrapped in a clean blanket provided by the Americans. Luxuries that seemed miraculous after months of filth and deprivation. He slept now, his tiny face peaceful in a way that squeezed her heart. For the first time since his conception, she allowed herself to consider a future beyond mere survival. Helena joined her, moving with the stiffness of age compounded by malnutrition. "He saved us as much as we saved him," she said softly, echoing words spoken days earlier in the darkness of their cell. But now, in the light of freedom, they carried new meaning. Zofia looked up, question in her eyes. "He gave us something to protect," Helena explained. "A reason to remain human when everything around us demanded we become animals." One by one, the other women gathered around them, drawn by some unspoken need for closure to their shared ordeal. They formed a circle around mother and child, each face bearing the same complex mixture of emotions: grief for what had been lost, wonder at having survived, uncertainty about what awaited them in a world forever altered. Marta, who had risked her own safety by stepping forward when the guard threatened discovery, knelt beside Zofia. "I never betrayed you," she said quietly. "That day, when I returned with bread, I told the guard nothing about you. I let him think I would inform if I learned anything useful. It was the only protection I could offer." The revelation hung in the air, a final truth unveiled in the clarity of freedom. The suspicions that had divided them in captivity now seemed trivial against the magnitude of their collective endurance. An American photographer approached, asking through the interpreter for permission to document their group. The women straightened instinctively, dignity asserting itself through the rags of imprisonment. They arranged themselves around Zofia and Alexander, heads held high despite their emaciated frames and shaved heads. This was not shame to be hidden, but testimony to be preserved. As the camera captured their image for posterity, tears flowed freely down hollow cheeks. These were not the silent tears of captivity, carefully concealed lest they be interpreted as weakness, but open weeping born of release. Some cried for lost family members who would never know they had survived, others for the months and years stolen from their lives. All for the simple miracle of standing under an open sky, breathing air not tainted by fear. Later, as they boarded trucks that would transport them to proper medical facilities, Zofia stood at the threshold of the prison that had nearly become her grave. The stone walls that had confined her now seemed smaller, less imposing in defeat. American soldiers moved methodically through the compound, documenting evidence, freeing any prisoners who might remain hidden in remote sections. She turned to take one final look at the place where her son had been born against all odds. The other women did the same, their gazes a silent reckoning with the past before facing forward toward uncertain futures. None spoke. Words were insufficient vessels for the weight of their experience. What they carried away could not be seen or touched, not the tangible horrors of starvation and abuse, but the knowledge of what humans could endure when stripped of everything except the choice to protect one another. They had entered as individuals, thrown together by the arbitrary cruelty of their captors. They departed as something else, bonded by an experience that those who hadn't shared it could never fully comprehend. As the trucks pulled away, Helena placed her weathered hand over Alexander's tiny one. "In the darkest place," she whispered, "we found the brightest light." The simple truth of her words resonated through their group. In the midst of calculated evil, they had witnessed the birth of something pure. In a place designed to eradicate humanity, they had rediscovered its essential quality. Life, stubborn and persistent, had emerged from the shadow of death, a reminder that even in humanity's darkest hour, the capacity for love remained undefeated. The prison receded behind them, diminishing in size but never in memory. Ahead lay a world in ruins, a continent struggling to rebuild from the ashes of hatred. Their journey would not be easy. But as baby Alexander stirred against his mother's chest, his tiny hand reaching up to touch her face, Zofia felt something she had thought forever lost in the darkness of their captivity: hope. The story of these Polish women reminds us that even in our darkest hours, when humanity seems lost, the smallest flame of compassion can illuminate the deepest shadows. These prisoners, stripped of everything but their choice to protect one another, discovered that true freedom begins in the heart long before the chains are broken. What would you have done in Zofia's place? Would you have risked everything to protect a life when your own hung by the thinnest thread? In a world that often celebrates individual survival, these women chose collective strength. They understood that to surrender the baby would be to surrender the last piece of their humanity, the final victory their captors sought. Their story challenges us to examine our own moral courage. When faced with impossible choices, do we retreat into self-preservation, or do we reach beyond our fear to protect what is most vulnerable? Perhaps the measure of our humanity isn't found in our moments of comfort, but in our responses when everything is at stake. If this story moved you, if it made you reflect on the extraordinary capacity for compassion that exists even in the most desperate circumstances, please share it with others who might find strength in these women's courage. Follow our channel for more stories that illuminate the darkest chapters of history and reveal the unbreakable spirit of those who lived through them. Because in remembering their struggles and triumphs, we honor not just their past, but our shared humanity.